Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our final Fold Academy of the season. I love seeing where everyone is located in terms of where they're tuning in from. So welcome. My name is Ardo Omer. I am the Kids Program Coordinator at Fold. And today we have Loghan Paylor here to talk about historical research in writing fiction. So before we start, we have a few housekeeping notes. This workshop is approximately 1 hour, which will include a 15-minute Q&A at the end. If you have questions during the workshop, please submit it using the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and Logan will answer them at the end. We are using Zoom auto captioning function, so please note some of the captions may not be transcribed correctly. However, all captions will be corrected when the recording is made available on YouTube. And yes, there will be a recording made in today's webinar. It will be uploaded to our YouTube channel next week, and those of you who registered will receive a email with a link. We are getting real close to the Festival of Literary Diversity, which will run from Sunday, April 26th to Sunday, May 3rd. I want to highlight a few sessions that are designed specifically with writers in mind, especially those who attend Fold Academy. Events include Pitch Perfect Live, which is a live manuscript critique by agents and editors, the Writers Hub, a virtual marketplace where you can meet representatives from different literary organizations and publishers, and then of course panels and workshops that will teach you all about the publishing industry and the craft of writing. I want to flag that we do have Logan, who was recently on Canada Reads, their book in particular, and so they'll be on there with three of the other four books that were represented authors to talk about what it's like on the author end of things. So stay tuned for that. That's going to take place on Sunday, April 26th. So registration is open. Visit thefullcanada.org for the full schedule and registration info. Finally, I'm so excited to introduce Logan. Loghan Paylor is a queer trans writer whose first novel, The Cure for Drowning, won this year's Canada Reads. It was also longlisted for the Giller Prize, named Globe and Mail Best Book, and is a finalist for the Jim Deva Prize for Writing That Provokes. Their work has also appeared in Room, Prairiefire, and on the long list of for the NBC, not NBC, the CBC Nonfiction Prize. A graduate of the Writers Studio at Simon Fraser University, they have an MFA in creative writing from the University of British Columbia and divide their time between teaching, writing, and co-owning a game company. Okay, I need to make sure I ask Logan about that in the Q&A. That sounds like so much fun. So let's all give Logan a warm welcome. Welcome, Logan.
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here today. Thank you so much for inviting me. Um, Before I jump into my talk, I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Stalo Coast Salish peoples, where teaching and storytelling have occurred for thousands of years. I am grateful for the opportunity to live here in this beautiful part of the world and to continue teaching and writing in this place. I would also like to thank the Festival of Literary Diversity for inviting me to do this workshop, and in particular to Lynn and Ardo, who have worked so very hard behind the scenes for not only this, but all the webinars and everything that's upcoming. So without further ado, I'm going to start my little presentation here for you. All right, so today I'm going to talk about historical research and how I approach writing historical fiction. I'll talk about some of the research I did specifically for my novel, but also mostly about kind of research strategies in general, including kind of where to start, where to look, how to stay organized, how not to like lose your mind while you're doing all of it. And then, yes, as Ardo said, we've set aside 15 to 20 minutes at the end where we're going to answer questions. So, yes, if you have questions, please just pop them in the chat as we go along, and I will be delighted to talk about them at the end. So just a little bit about me, a little more about me. my name is Logan, and I am, among other things, a writer. I grew up in a rural community in southwestern Ontario, and I have lived in British Columbia for almost 15 years now. Wow. This is my book, The Cure for Drowning. In my other lives, I teach writing at the University of British Columbia and Simon Fraser University. And this is my teaching assistant, Sullivan. He is not here today because, shockingly, he is a terrible assistant, so I had to kick him out before we began today. All right, so to start us off, I think it's helpful to right off the bat kind of talk about two different types of historical writing because I think, especially when it comes to research, they can kind of get glommed together. And I like to kind of create a little bit of separation early on so we kind of know where we're headed. So the two different types of historical writing are nonfiction and fiction. So historical nonfiction is a type of academic or science communication writing. It's primarily informative, and it seeks to explain patterns and the cause and effect of historical events. It is often detailed. It includes academic conventions such as footnotes, citations, bibliographies, and above all, it seeks to present facts and analyze them through a particular critical or philosophical lens. So, good historical nonfiction will prioritize facts over narrative. Historical fiction, on the other hand, which is going to be our focus today, is a form of creative storytelling that uses research about a historical time period to create an immersive experience for a reader. It utilizes facts about the past to inform things like character development, plot, setting, and conflict. Historical fiction is often richly detailed with research, and it can be meticulously constructed to be very similar to nonfiction in how accurately it reflects the past. But it is at its core still a creative and not academic book, and one that will prioritize narrative over facts if and when it must. So, as a quick summary, nonfiction is a collection of facts arranged by a narrative, while fiction is narrative informed by a collection of facts. So I just have some opening questions for you. You can jot these down for yourself. Also, since this will be posted later, you're welcome to just kind of sit and absorb this and then tune in later to the recording to really do these exercises and questions more in depth. But some opening questions I think are important to ask ourselves when we start working on any kind of historical research is first off, why am I drawn to writing about this time or place in the past? And it's okay if you don't have an immediate answer. Sometimes it is a very kind of nebulous curiosity. Sometimes it's coming from a place of, interest in family history. Other times, it can be very intriguing to try and find or solve something about the past. Maybe you want to explore a different perspective. And sometimes, certainly from a creative writing standpoint, it can be that this time in the past presents really unique possibilities as a setting for a fictional story. Another question then is to say, okay, is my goal primarily informative or creative? If I'm interested in this time in the past because I'm really excited about all the facts and information, that's important to know off the bat, versus is my interest maybe a little bit more creatively driven? And again, it's okay if you're unsure off the top of a project, but it's a good thing to check in with yourself if your inspiration is coming from a storytelling place or a fact-finding place. And the reason I think these questions are important is because it's question 2B, I guess. What kind of writing will best serve my ideas, right? Because there are so many different types of historical writing, like we talked about on the last slide. And sometimes there are ideas that are better expressed through non-fictional historical writing, whether that's essays, whether that's academic books or biography and so on, versus historical fiction specifically. And there are certainly plenty of historical fiction novels out there that might have worked a little bit better as nonfiction and also vice versa. So it's just good to kind of have that in mind as you embark on a project. So, one thing to keep in mind as well is that when you do all of this research, only about 10 to 20% of what you learn in your research will actually physically end up on the page in words that a reader will see. However, it's really important to still do all of the research because when it's done thoroughly, it will shape your character arcs, your plot lines, your settings, and conflicts, and so on. It will become kind of embedded and interwoven into your narrative. So it's okay. So just, be prepared going in to know that the amount of work you do versus what will eventually show up on the page is going to be a small, small percentage. So when it comes to writing historical fiction, I think I at least always go in with this expectation that I'm going to be perfectly organized. It's going to be great, and the reality looks more like this. Um, Storytelling and research can interact in mysterious and creative ways. And I think sometimes we hamstring ourselves when we try to draw really strict lines between the two because ideally, right, the research that we do will inform our storytelling, and then the story that we're telling will also come back and inform our research. So, for the purposes of today's chat, I'm going to probably draw some kind of distinctions here, but just know that it really is an interwoven process. And some people like to start with storytelling and add research. Other people start with research and then begin on the narrative. All of that's fine. There's no one correct way. Just kind of follow what feels intuitive to you. So, where to start? Right? It's a big, overwhelming question. The place to start is by reading widely and getting an overview of whatever your research area is. So, here is a non limited list starting place of things you might do to start learning about your time period. Um, and the place I often start is with Wikipedia articles. I read Wikipedia articles about my target time period, or TT for short, in this list. That should not be where it ends, I should emphasize. Wikipedia is a great place to start to just kind of get a little appetizer taste of what is out there. It should be the first step on your journey, not the first and last. So everything from watching documentaries, there's plenty of really interesting history podcasts out there now, which are a great way to kind of get a little sampling of hearing someone who's very knowledgeable about a particular time period chat about their subject area. Um, you can watch films and listen to media that was created that time period if that's available. Um, I also find it useful to kind of read or skim books that were published in that era, especially in like fiction and poetry, because that's a great way to kind of tap into like what the zeitgeist was at the time. Um, Good rule of thumb, always check your facts against at least two reliable sources of any information. Um, and as you start your research, you will likely have questions or subtopics that catch your interest. It's very important that you write them down in one place as you go along to save yourself a lot of headaches down the road. So, once you've done a bit of overview research, you're going to ideally end up with a list of questions and subtopics that have come up as you go along. So, in my method, I then use those questions and subtopics to guide my next round of research, right? And then, so as more questions come up, I write them down, and then that becomes the next focus, right? So it becomes a rinse and repeat cycle until I'm satisfied that I've found enough for what I need. So, for example, one of my earliest research questions that came up during my kind of overview research for the cure for drowning was what Toronto looked like in 1939. I did realize I didn't have a visual for that. And so that question led me into archival research and mostly just looking at photographs that were all digitized online to kind of get an idea of like what the building architecture looked like, what kind of advertisements were out there, yada, yada. If you're feeling stuck, um, because starting a big overview question is kind of a big ask. Um, these are some questions that I think are useful to kind of help you chip into a bigger topic and start looking at it as smaller subtopics. And these are particularly oriented to be relevant to narrative writing, right? So, what did people in my target time period eat? And how did they produce or acquire food? What did they wear? How did they create their clothing? What games, stories, and jokes were popular? This can be a really fun way to kind of understand a little bit more about, again, like a time period, the zeitgeist, like what did people find funny in this time period? Um, second last question is a little morbid, like how did most people die? But I think that is important for storytelling because it will tell you what the stakes are for these characters, right? If they're living in a time period where there's a very high mortality rate from a particular disease or like what the average lifespan is, like that will give you important information about, what did your characters dwell on? What were they afraid of? And how did that inform their choices? So here is a good point. I invite you to jot down a couple of storytelling questions you think might help you get started if you're feeling a bit stuck on subtopics. So this is an example of kind of my narrowing from overview to more detailed subtopics. So my big overview topic I started with was just Canada during the Second World War, which is a huge research topic. So I started by, yeah, just like reading articles, watching a couple documentaries. I read some big overview books. And then I realized I had questions about the Royal Canadian Air Force specifically. So in my next round of research, I looked into the RCAF. And as I looked into sources about that, I looked at archival photos. Um, I read a lot of like online museum resources, which are excellent. We'll get into that a bit later. And from there, I was like, okay, actually, I think I'm really interested in. I have a lot of questions about Bomber Command specifically. So then I started looking into Bomber Command, um, the structures of what daily life was like and how did it work and how did it change throughout the war. And so I went down and down and down through this like rinse repeat of topic questions. And I ended up with my actual sort of target specific research was Lancaster Bomber Crew in 1942, stationed in Lincolnshire. And then that became a pretty manageable focus of research. And I was able to, that made it a lot easier, right, to go through archives because I had a date in mind and a specific location, and there were certain things that I was looking for. And then on this slide as well, I have some other um, examples. So like here at the bottom, right, history of Halifax, when I knew that that was going to be one of the settings. Okay, not the entire history of Halifax, what Halifax during Second World War. Okay, and then within that, I actually want to know more about Africville in 1942, 1943. So the idea is like a big inverted triangle. You start big and you get small. So then once you're kind of narrowing down, you've got some subtopics, you're getting on a roll. The question becomes, okay, well, which details? Like, how do I pick what is going to be important? Maybe you've amassed just so much research. You're like, okay, well, I don't quite know what to do with this. Or on the other side, you are staring at this, being like, well, I don't really know what to look for or what to pick out. So my suggestion for this is to focus on the things that your characters would interact with every day and that would most directly impact their lives. And I think this is a good starting place, kind of regardless of which time period you're looking at, like whether you're doing research into like ancient Mesopotamia, whether you're looking into like Regency Scotland, um, or like Canada in 1914. Um, and from a storytelling perspective, your goal isn't to collect all of the facts and arrange them into a narrative. That's the goal of nonfiction. Your goal as a fiction writer is to figure out how your characters and your story would live in this world. And to do that, you need the details that are going to inform that plotline. So again, this is a non-exhaustive list. But here are some subtopics that I would suggest if you are looking at doing research into a setting. Um, and these are all like basic things that we interact with, even, today on an everyday basis, right? So questions of housing, right? How do people keep hot and cool? Did they have running water? What kind of chores needed to be done every day? What sort of maintenance was required on houses? And where did most people live? Because that's going to change depending on where in the world and what time period you're looking at. And my experience has been that a lot of inspiration I found like for writing scenes and creating character conflict actually emerged out of those like little everyday things, right? So for example, if you're writing a story set in a time period where your characters don't have running water in their house, which is like the vast majority of history, you know, part of their day would have to be about finding drinkable water, right? And collecting water to use for hygiene and, you know, cooking and eating and bathing and so on. So that logically has to figure somewhere in your story. You at least have to account for it. So I think that methodology can kind of apply through all these categories. Um, Relationships is like a big kind of vague term, but what I meant was like, who are your characters likely to live with? Do they live in multi-generational homes? Do they live in big urban centers? Do they live in small communities? Who is in their social circle? Um, I find a useful question sometimes is like, how many people would they be likely to meet in their lifetime? Because that number changes greatly depending on when and where in history you're researching. Um, and branching from that, like, who would their romantic options be? Right? Is it more likely that they would meet and fall in love with someone from their own community? Was there an expectation that they would somehow travel and meet outside of that circle? Right? If they're in a big urban environment, there's a lot of options, that kind of thing. Media too can be a very rich subtopic. Um, you know, thinking about, okay, what did are my characters listen to? Right? Could they read? If they could read, what did they read? What were they likely to discuss? Um, what kind of things would they imagine? Right? What topics would come up in social situations? Um, and I mean, this has changed drastically throughout history, but you know, right now, you know, if we think about sort of like water cooler talk, right? And these days, a lot of topics of conversation are about television, right? There's certain television shows right now in 2026 in Canada that people will gather together to chat about because they are current and debate. But in the past, you know, that was radio plays, or it was serially published novels. Like in the UK, it would like Dickens books would have been a topic of conversation every week. Um, Things like plays, people went to see those, and so on. So the further back you go in history, it's worth considering. Okay, what did people fill their time talking about? And then last on here, I think law and government. That can be a huge topic, again, depending on your research. But I think it's worth considering, you know, what impact would law enforcement and laws have on people's daily lives. So I'm not going to read through all of this for you. You're welcome to come back and read it in detail on the recording. But this is just one paragraph from my novel. And I included it here because I wanted to show uh, this is one paragraph that probably there's about 20 to 30 hours of research went into this one paragraph in the final book. Um, and so when we think about choosing details, this was really important during this section of the book. So things like the ground crew, the Irks, right, the stretcher bearers. You know, I did so much research into kind of understanding what an experience would be as an airman, you know, being sent out to fly a mission and then coming back. There were so many moving pieces, so many details. It was far too many to include in a fiction novel. And so this paragraph is just kind of one example of, you know, what did I choose to focus on? And here I used my narrating character in this moment about, okay, what would Kit be seeing just from their perspective, and what would they notice, right? What would matter to them? So, you know, the sounds of all the aircraft landing, all the people running around the Irks, the stretcher bearers, right? What different members of their crew are doing after the mission. And like, what would they be thinking about? Oh, they're hungry. They're thinking about breakfast. And, you know, they're not in that moment, right? They wouldn't be thinking about, you know, all of the great complicated political and like war machinery that's going on around them. They're thinking like, I can't wait to like drink some coffee and get a good meal into me because it's been a long night. So then we have the question, where do I look? Again, you can come back to these slides because I've packed a lot on here. So normal mode, normal places to look, libraries, museums. There's so many digitized archives, and both like regional and national museums are a treasure trove of information. Archives and historical societies have lots of good stuff as well. Used bookstores are a great place to go to kind of look for more like niche topic books and books from smaller presses. Talking to indie bookstore owners as well. They will likely have some leads on good suggestions for where to get books. Newspaper archives, college and university collections, etc. Right? All of these are very, I think, like top of the brain places we would think of. So they're a great first place to start. If you want to go a little bit more offbeat, um, this is where I did quite a bit of my research. I think especially for writing fiction, right? The kind of the top half of this slide is a really great place to start, especially for nonfiction. But if writing historical fiction, often a lot of your questions are going to end up being less about the sort of factual unfolding of history and more about sort of people and culture and stuff like that. So this is where I spend a lot of my time doing research. I went back into cookbooks and food history. That was really helpful. I looked at architecture and photography books. I watched a lot of films and listened to music and read comic books from the 1930s and 40s. I went back into the newspaper archives, but I focused mostly on things like obituaries and personal ads, because to me, that's where I felt like I could sort of see the people, um, and understand a little more about where they were coming from. Graveyards, jail records, court records, right? Again, those can be a good way to kind of understand, like, okay, well, what was the focus, right? What kinds of crimes were really being focused on, both in newspapers and by the government, and so on. So, and as well, the magazines and catalogs were very helpful in terms of fashion and understanding, what was current and what would have been considered, um, out of fashion, especially because fashion changed so rapidly between the 1930s and 40s. And then we come to the unhinged side of research. These are all of the really zany niche places that I don't often see other people recommend, but I found very helpful. Um, Niche hobby specialists, reenactment groups. Go find the people who are fanatically passionate about whatever project you're working on, whatever your time period is, and ask them questions. They will be delighted to talk to you about their hobbies. One of my favorite games is to walk into antique stores, and they often have postcards. You can, like, old postcards you can buy for very little money, like 10 cents to $1 each. These are delightful. I found so many story hooks, and it was a great way to kind of get an idea of the way people wrote, kind of the cadence and the grammar that was in vogue. Um, I've said erotica here. This is only if you're over 18. But looking at what kind of materials were, like, what books were banned, right? What materials were considered illegal or illicit, can tell you a lot about, what was sort of going on under the surface of a society. Reddit thread arguments, not always the best place to start for factual research, but it will tell you really quickly what the most controversial or debated points of your research topic are, similar to YouTube video comment sections. Use at your own risk, but it can be very productive. Um, and then things like city planning records, minutes from official meetings, especially if you're doing very localized research to like a specific town or city, they will have records stretching back a long way. And then old phone books, depending on, especially if you're doing research in kind of the 20th century. Those are a gold mine of lots of things. As a caveat, please do not trespass or otherwise break the law while you're doing this. So my big kind of bugbear question was, what does the interior of a Lancaster bomber look like? Because there were so many different aircraft that were flown during the war, and they were changing all the time. Old and new aircraft flew in the same squadrons because they were replacing planes that got shot down and so on. I was losing my mind trying to answer this question. And then the people who saved my bacon were the World War II model aircraft community blogs, because they were full of people who build miniature military aircraft to scale as a hobby, and they spend a lot of time arguing about the accuracy of their different reproductions. And they were incredible. I learned so much from them, and they were the ones who were able to help me kind of solve the question of, like, what is this setting going to look like for part two of my book. The comment sections on IMDb and YouTube for wartime period films are also a great place to find people who are very passionate about specific details. So now what? You've done all this research. have all these details. What next? Your mileage may vary, but my suggestion is to put all of your research aside and write the next section of your manuscript without looking at your research notes. And if that causes a tingle of dread to go down your spine, just stay with me for a second because I think it does a couple of important things. First, it helps your brain kind of shift gears between research mode and creative mode. Um, when we're in research mode, right, we're very much like taking in information, right? It's a very sort of receptive state. And I think in creative mode, right, we're trying to kind of go the other way, right? We're trying to take something inside us and put it out on the page. And so, in my experience, it has been helpful to kind of um, create a little bit of space for each of those to work on its own. It also allows your mind to naturally sift for only the details that are relevant to your story and your characters. So it's a way to avoid over description, right? If you're writing your story and you have a list of facts next to you, right there, I think there's this unconscious tendency to feel like, oh, we have to include all of them. And that can quickly lead to sort of like over description, right? And overwriting. Whereas if your notes are out of sight and you're just focused on your story and your characters, the natural questions that come up when we're doing a piece of creative writing, right? Like, okay, well, what would this character do next? Or, well, okay, how would they get from this scene to the next one? Or, I know they're arguing, but like, why are they so really passionate about this? Those questions, because you've done your research, the answers that come to you are going to be informed by the historical research you've done, right? So it's going to, ideally, it would feel a little bit natural in the moment, right? Like, okay, well, how would the characters get from here to there? Oh, well, obviously they'd take the tram. That was the most common public transportation at the time. Or, what are they arguing about? Oh, well, you know, they're upset because money is really tight and they have to, choose between X and Y because of this overarching political situation, right? So it's going to kind of sift into your writing and sort of underpin a lot of the creative work that's going on. It's also a way to really quickly identify gaps in your knowledge, right? If you're saying like, my character walked into the room and put on, you're like, oh, I don't actually know what winter clothing would look like in this time period. Okay, well, there's a question to write down, and you can come back to that in your research. So overall, it lets your creative and analytical skills combine so that the story that emerges is informed by historical facts, but it's not dictated by your research. Remember, the goal of a fiction project is a creative narrative informed by a collection of facts, not the other way around. I don't think I put this on the slides, so just one method that I use, just jumping back to when I find a gap in my knowledge. I have a little symbol that I use in my manuscripts. You can use like a single word or a particular combination of characters. It can be nonsense, that's fine. But whenever you come to a gap that you don't know the answer to, you just put that little symbol and you write the question here. You say, like, put in winter clothes here, right? But it's important that you use the same symbol each time because then when you go back and you're editing your manuscript, you can use like Control F, like find in document for that specific symbol, and that will help you jump to all the places in your manuscript where you left gaps, and that will make your research easier. You can come do the research, come back, and just plug things in where they belong. It's like saved me a lot of time. So I think another important question that comes up, right? Especially when we're doing all this research, we're finding all this really cool stuff. We need to ask ourselves whether something has historical versus narrative value. Because sometimes you'll come across a fact that you find really interesting, something that you are very excited about, like an interesting little piece of history that you can't wait to share with everyone. But it doesn't actually relate to your story, or it doesn't have a logical place in your narrative. So my method is that I always try and include it in an early draft. I just throw it in because early drafts are about just tossing everything in the soup pot because you never know, right? It might be useful later on. But at a certain point in drafting manuscript, you will have to decide if certain details, certain facts are actually helpful to a reader's understanding of this story or whether they are distracting. So it's really the kind of historical fiction version of Kill Your Darlings. Um, and I this was something I tried to be very aware of because I've read a lot of historical fiction, and there are times in books where I feel like I can see it, like when another author has been very excited about this particular thing. But as a reader, I'm like, I don't know, that's not, it's kind of distracting me, or this is just adding more detail than I really needed in this moment, right? Um, and so for me, I always try and keep the reader's experience in the front of my mind when I'm doing edits later on, right? And so, regardless of what my level of passion is for a very particular nitpicky thing about a Lancaster bomber, um, I had to pause and ask myself, okay, is the reader going to care about this? Is this going to help them picture this scene more clearly? Is this going to help them understand the characters or the setting? Or is this just going to be a little bit distracting and doesn't really belong here? And yeah, in historical fiction, the story always has to come first. Other times, kind of on the flip side of this, sometimes you're going to come across a small but irritating little fact that undermines a key part of your narrative. And in my case, it was the publication of a specific book in 1939. It's okay to change, tweak, or ignore some of the details within reason. That is okay. You just should acknowledge it somewhere at the end of your book. What if I just can't find the answer? I'm going to speed out. I want to make sure we keep an eye on time. So sometimes there are questions that just simply can't be answered, right? Maybe the knowledge has been destroyed or lost, records are gone. In my case, I was left with a lot of unanswered questions about Africville, which is a historic black neighborhood in Halifax that was demolished and rebuilt in the 1970s. Because it was a historically impoverished neighborhood, there were few photographs or formal records kept of the area. So at a certain point, in terms of research, you just have to let it go and accept that you won't be able to know everything. And one advantage of writing fiction is that if you do find these big gaps in history, you have the opportunity to, you know, resurrect the spirit of that place and time by considering what if and creating people and characters who reflect that piece of lost history. Um, how do I keep track of everything? Uh, I would suggest you take time to come up with a system, however basic, at the beginning. Different people have different um, systems. Um, you can use bookmark folders, section Word documents, etc. Even just a folder labeled novel research is better than nothing. The best system is one you're actually going to use consistently, and any good system that becomes an excuse to procrastinate on writing is not a good system. So, as part of the end, or this is, sorry, I'll start again. I have created a document. The link is going to be in the chat for kind of research template. So you are welcome to take this and adapt it however you like. You can do whatever you want with it, but I find this is kind of a helpful way, especially when starting out, to just kind of keep track of research, and so you don't absolutely lose your mind with facts flying everywhere. So I create a title with a topic, right? My big topic. I keep a quick running list of all the sources I've used. If I'm doing research online, I'm literally just copying and pasting links to websites, just keeping track of them. Then I have a section where I write down the questions that come to mind as I'm reading, and then any other subtopics that I want to talk about or look further into. So once I have that, then I'll create either another document or another page or another section in my document and pull out my questions, right? Question one. Okay, what did RCAF pilots eat in the barracks? Okay, source I used to find that information. What was the answer? The answer was a lot of chocolate. Shockingly, there was a lot of chocolate that the airmen ate, which I did not realize. And then again, through doing that research, maybe there's new subtopics that emerge. I'm like, oh, they ate a lot of chocolate. Okay, why? Who was supplying that, right? And then that can lead into more research from there. So the Google link to the doc is one you can edit it. You can take it and use the template. That's fine. But yeah, that's just one way to kind of keep all of your info organized. And then last but not least, this is just a quick starter reading list. If you are interested in reading more widely in historical fiction, this is a non-exhaustive list of books where that I think are great and that really do a good job of exemplifying that balance between research and narrative, and that do a good job of putting the story first in all contexts. So again, I won't linger here. You can check this back on the recording. But yeah, they're all wonderful, and I encourage you to check them out. All right. Oh, I did it. Right on time. All right, so we can switch to questions here.
Amazing. I loved your tip about putting the research down when you start writing, because it becomes very hard not to use the research as the thing you rely on to write creatively, and but then you end up just writing descriptions of the historical facts as opposed to like actually, oh, I'm informed enough where I can write something creatively, and then I always have the option to come back.
Yeah, exactly.
Amazing. Okay. So we are in the Q&A time, which means if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you don't see that for whatever reason, there's a more button with three dots. Click on that and you should be able to find it. Unfortunately, due to the sheer number of questions, if it's in the chat, it won't be answered. And for those of you who prefer to ask your question verbally, you can just raise your hand. I just ask that if you go that route, please make your question brief, just so we can get through all of the questions that we have in the Q&A box. Alrighty, I will start with this question that asks, could we say that historical memoir falls somewhere between fiction and nonfiction?
That is a good question. I think it depends a little bit on like who is doing the writing, like the perspective. I think, writing historical biographies to my definition falls under nonfiction. Um, Memoir, I think it does kind of fall between. Yeah, sorry. I don't know if I have a better answer. I'm not entirely sure I fully understand what historical memoir is. So I don't want to speak out of turn. But yeah, I created that at the beginning as kind of an artificial divide, but there definitely are lots of subgenres that overlap for sure.
Amazing. I have Wendy here who will ask their question. Oh, sorry. Ask to unmute.
Do you want me to ask my question?
Yes, yes.
So, Logan, thanks so much for all of this. Do you think it's easier, and I've got quotation marks around the word easier, to use a first person narrator in historical fiction?
I don't think it's necessarily easier. I wish I had a simple answer for you of like, yeah, this is the one trick that will work. I think what depends the most is the story you're telling. And that's going to be the real differentiator. But certainly there are plenty of writers, myself included, who start writing drafts in one POV, like may start in, say, third person, and then try drafts in first person and find out they work better. Um, so, yeah, my advice would be to just write whatever feels natural and then uh, experiment to see if you've got the right choice.
Awesome. I have someone who asks, this might be a silly question, but how do you organize your files of source materials? I have so many PDFs of scanned documents, images, etc., and I've been renaming them to indicate the source and focus, which means the names are unwieldy, but I know there's gotta be a better way. Any specific apps or software?
Feel like I'm not up to date on like the most current apps because the ones I was using, I feel like there are a few that are just defunct now because this was like almost 10 years ago now. Um, I think, again, as I said in the presentation, is whatever system you'll actually use is the best one. I've seen there's lots of like great guides and how-tos online. There's other people who are like really more organized than I am who can give you good guides on that. I've had a lot of success with Notion, which is like a free software template that's for organization. There's lots of great guides from that. Um, and that one is helpful because you can kind of create pages and documents and tables and all kinds of things like in this software. But also, I mean, just the folder system of having folders and subfolders and so on. It's really going to depend per person. So I wish you luck.
So I have. Is it okay? There we go. Can you tell us about a time when you got stuck while doing research for your book, and how did you get unstuck? And I think that's a great companion question too. Can you talk about the timeline of writing The Cure for Drowning in terms of research and writing?
Yeah, sure. So we'll start with the timeline. It took me 6 years from beginning to end. And there were times during that period where I was doing more research and other times where I was doing more of the writing. I kind of like drifted back and forth. Um, and I found like I did a lot of research at the beginning, did a lot of kind of writing in the middle, and then there was a period towards the end when I was on draft, I lost track, 15, 16, where I went back and did a lot more intense research to really kind of fill it out. So yeah, took a long time. And in terms of getting stuck, actually, one of the things that really blocked me was trying to understand the absolute maze that was the command structure in the Air Force in the UK. Because there was the Royal Canadian Air Force, the Royal Indian Air Force, the Australian Air Force, and the Royal Air Force in Britain all together. And so, as you can imagine, it was quite complicated about who reported to who and why. And once I'm not someone who was like naturally interested in all the really detailed bits of like command structure and ranking, so I got very confused early on. And then what got me unstuck was actually really sitting with that question of like, what is the narrative value of this information? And I realized that, my characters themselves actually wouldn't necessarily know beyond their commanding officer and maybe the person above him what else was going on in the war. And so that really helped me get unstuck because I stopped focusing on trying to give a huge overview and just focused on, okay, in daily life on this airbase, who is most likely to get this character in trouble? Who are they afraid of like acting out in front of? And who is going to be the person to give them a stern talking to if they mess up? And that's it.
Great strategy. So I'm gonna kind of combine these questions, but I'll start with this one. So I have someone here who says they're not indigenous, but they're writing a story about their ancestor from the 18th century, and specifically this ancestor encountered different indigenous tribes. But the historical records are terrible, and they do not distinguish between these cultures at all. So they wanted to know if there's any tips on respectfully connecting with specific indigenous communities to understand culture, language, customs, communities without being extractive.
That is a really excellent question. Um, and there are, oh, you've caught me cold, so I'm blanking on the exact title of this book. There have been several books published in the last few years about like how to write about Indigenous communities, respectfully, how to conduct research. And I will look it up right after this webinar. Can I send it to you, Ardo,
Yes, you can send
in
it
an
to me.
email? Okay. Yeah, I can send you a short list of good resources. But in the meantime, a good place to start would be either visiting like the local Indigenous Cultural Center that's closest to you. Many universities as well across the country now have kind of indigeneity programs around like research and sort of respectful work in that arena. So checking UBC absolutely has a huge portion in their website now and guides for researchers about that question exactly. So that's the first place I would point you towards. And there's people who are much more knowledgeable than me who will be able to give you more specific advice.
And someone else asked, what if there isn't much contextual research done in a particular time period?
Yeah, that does happen. Um, I think then you kind of have, I don't know, like more than two choices, but two kind of general choices. Um, One option is to like do some of the research yourself, right? Like it's very possible, depending on how niche of a topic you're looking into, is like you may be, one of the first people looking into these specific primary sources in a specific area. And so there's some opportunity there to kind of add to the field yourself. Um, Another option would be to kind of acknowledge, like, yeah, this is sort of a gap here, and to, uh, you can use imagination. You are writing fiction after all. So I think with like correct acknowledgments, you can write fictionally into that space as well.
Oh, there's a clarification to the question. Being stuck when there was very limited info in places and time periods. 17th century, developing country, paper records, but not much about particular place or mostly colonizer records. So they're wondering if it's more like traveling to location or interviews. Yeah.
That seems like a great, yeah, I think that would be a really good place to start.
I will say, I'm Somali, and
Mhm,
so and that is a community that is primarily oral tradition.
mhm.
And I also sometimes think, in the same way that when you're writing a book creatively, if you're just pure fiction, not really like research based, there's like a time and place for that book. You may not be able to. It's not a book that's like I'm gonna, write it and it's gonna be done. Sometimes you're like, maybe I'm not in a place to write it. I feel like research is also like I can't find the information now, but something's going to happen maybe a few months down the line where I'll find that missing piece. And for me, I found a lot of places in Italian universities, and you do have to take like that research with a grain of salt by comparing it to other things. But there is a point where I do have to talk to like Somalis in Somalia, because
Yeah.
again, it's very oral, tradition based. So it is it's tough. It's tough when you have colonization involved. It's tough when it's a society that a lot of the like far historical stuff is not really like written down per se. So it gets tricky, but I guess that's also where the fiction comes in as well, of
Mhm.
historical fiction. Let
No,
us
that's a great
see.
point. Thank you.
Um, Someone wanted to know if you used personal archive materials, diaries, letters, etc.
I did, yes. I was able to find through a couple of the war museums and a few sort of smaller regional collections. Yeah, there's also been, especially through smaller presses, there are often, you can find, yeah, like personal published works. Like they're often works of like family history that someone has collected and published. So the short answer is yes, I definitely use those.
Amazing. And so, Wendy, who had actually asked a question earlier, had said that the Elements of Indigenous Style by Greg Younging. I don't know if that's the
That's the
book you
book I
were
was thinking.
thinking of.
It was the book I
So,
was thinking of,
yeah,
yes.
so Elements of Indigenous Style by Greg Younging is the book that Logan wanted to mention.
Thank you,
Um,
Wendy.
Speaking of travel, I don't know if you did any actual traveling for this book, but did you use granting funding to support research and travel?
So that was my plan. I had some very ambitious research travel planned where I was going to go to the War Museum in Ottawa. I was going to travel to the UK. I was going to go to Halifax. I was very excited about it, but then that was all planned for the spring of 2020. So it didn't end up happening. So initially I was like very disappointed about that. But I will say that there are a lot of archivists and librarians who spent the past decade digitizing museum archives. And so in the end, I was actually able to do uh, an incredible amount of research without needing to travel. Pretty much all of the exhibits and work that I would have been able to see in person in these museums is now online, which is amazing.
I'm going to combine these two questions because I think it really leans into one another. Um, Researching takes a lot of time, partly because, like we discussed, you don't have access to the research you need just yet. Um, One, were you working on other projects while working on this book for 6 years? Um, and two, I had it in my brain and I lost it. It was that and don't remember. I will look for that
That's okay.
second
I'll start on
question,
this one.
but
Yeah.
we'll start this first one. Were you working on other projects while working on this book?
I was, yes. So I started this novel as part of my Master's of Fine Arts thesis. So it helped to have a very um, specific deadline that I was working towards. I had to have a manuscript to hand in as my thesis. But in addition to that, I was also like in other workshop classes and writing short fiction and essays and all kinds of other things. And I think that is very helpful. It was really good for me because it meant that when I got super frustrated with this project or was just kind of oversaturated on research, I could pivot and either work on something completely different, or there were a couple of times where research I had done for this novel actually informed writing some like nonfiction essays as well.
Amazing. That's the upside too, right? It's you've done all of this research. Why not use it in different ways? Maybe not all the stories that are interesting to you will make it into the books. Why not utilize it elsewhere? And now I remember the second question, which is actually a question a lot of people were asking, which is when do you decide to stop researching? In particular, I think that what they're talking about in particular is the part before you start writing, because you can always go back to researching, because
Hmm.
now when you've written out the book, you know the gaps that you need to fill in. But that initial research to get started on writing, how do you know when to stop?
That is such a good question. Um, I wish I could remember who told me this. I don't remember if this is something I read somewhere or if someone said it to me, so I apologize for not having a source. But the best advice I received about that was the time to stop researching is when you start coming across facts and things that you already know. So if you're reading through
Oh,
a material like a book or you're watching a documentary and you find yourself mentally being like, yeah, 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 okay, okay, like I know this. It's like that's the sign of like, okay, you have accumulated enough material, you're familiar enough with it, like now you're just procrastinating and it's time to go start writing.
that is so good.
So it's such good
That is
advice.
so good.
Yeah.
Because I struggle with that too. Because I'm like, I can just research endlessly. And sometimes it is procrastination, right? You're like,
Mhm.
oh, I still have so much to do. I don't want to actually start that first, word on the page.
Yeah.
Um, but that's lovely. Oh man, I'm gonna take that with me. Let's see here. Let's see if we can do one more question. And there's so many thoughtful, really good questions. You are all
Mhm.
wonderful. This is such an engaged audience, and I love it. Okay, so someone asked, they've heard other authors sometimes hire a researcher or consult specialists in the field. And can you comment on this, and have you consulted people on a specific topic?
So I have never hired like a research assistant, or anything like that, although that does sound like the dream. I'm gonna think about that now. I think that is very helpful, especially because as you mentioned, Ardo, like researching takes a lot of time. And so yes, if you are in a position where you can hire someone to like help you with that, that's very great. Um, in terms of like hiring specialists and archivists and so on, I think that is very important to acknowledge like other people's research and labor and work. Most particularly in the context if you are consulting with people from marginalized communities and from indigenous communities, it's very important to make sure that you are paying people for their time and acknowledging that what they're doing for you is labor. Um, and yeah, I think it's a good mindset is to go into it not expecting people to give you things for free. So kind of come in with the intention of, reciprocating. And I found, at least I was pleasantly surprised that there were many, especially like historians who were excited to talk about like a research area over coffee and so on, and who were happy to answer a few questions over email. But yeah, just be respectful and mindful of other people's time and work.
Yeah, be respectful and also like we're all nerds here and these folks are also nerds. Like who doesn't want to talk about imagine that the thing that you're obsessed with, whether it's a TV show, music, something incredibly I found out about
Hmm.
Thomas the Tank Engine fans who are so obsessive and so knowledgeable. But like, and whatever passion it is, because to be a person who like that's your research field, you would have to have passion guide you through it to get to a
Hmm.
PhD level. Like that's so much
Absolutely.
schooling and time you're dedicating to it and stress, and finances, that of course are going to want to talk to you. And yeah, it's like what Logan said, just be, respectful of their time. And yeah, that's unfortunately the end of this workshop. But again, it'll be available on replay. Logan also has a wonderful file that's kind of something that you can use as a template for your research. So we'll make sure to use that. We'll have that link in along with the recording. It'll also be embedded in the video as well. But thank you, Logan, for that wonderful resource. And I just want to thank everyone for not just tuning in, but also just being a very engaged audience and asking so many wonderful questions. And yeah. And I did see that question that was asking about Logan's experience with Canada Reads, and I'm going to do something mean.
Okay.
I'm going to instead have you all go to the festival. The festival will do. Okay, this is something I'm going to tell you all. We will eventually advertise this. I encourage a festival pass because there are so many great events at the festival, and the virtual pass means you can access it until June 30th and access so many wonderful events and all of that fun stuff. However, Canada Reads will be a YouTube live event. So if you're hesitant about paying for a festival pass, which by the way, we do have a patron pass program, if that is something that is a financial barrier. But if you want to get a sneak peek into what the festival experience is like, the Canada Reads panel with Logan, with Joss, and two other wonderful authors that I can't remember because I have so many authors in my brain right
It's
now.
okay.
But four of the five authors will be on a panel with JL Richardson, the executive director of The Fold, to talk all about Canada Reads. So there will be a YouTube live as well as it'll be on the platform. So uh, that's a tip. That's a tip for all of you. But again, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Logan, for joining us. And we're gonna start doing a bit of a what is it called? Housekeeping. Housekeeping, housekeeping. So first off, subscribe to our newsletter, where, if you want to stay up to date on Fold, things like the YouTube live announcement, getting a festival pass, the types of events that are showing, etc. Just all the neat things we do for the festival, for Fold Academy, and just year round. Sign up. Sign up for the newsletter. There's a link in the chat right now. And for there's kids programming specific newsletters, there's Fold Academy specific newsletters, all of that. We also have a survey. So Fold Academy is for you. This program is for you. It's for you to get really cool resources, for you to attend workshops that matter to you and provide the information you need. So fill out the survey. Tell us what you like about the Fold Academy, what could be improved, and especially tell us what kind of topics you're interested as writers that you want to make sure is featured in Fold Academy. That survey link is also in the chat. And finally, Fold Academy is a free webinar series that we do, and we would love to keep offering it. So if you can, well, we'd love for you to donate by heading to thefoldcanada.org/donate. And there's a monthly option for donations as well as one-time donations, but it makes programs like Fold Academy that we offer for free remain free. So yeah. Again, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you as an audience, a particularly engaged audience, and I hope you have a fantastic and wonderful day.